All right, so this is Jason with Native Art Department International. This is the Maintaining Good Relations program at Artist Space, December 16th, 2017. We're at our 2 to 3 o'clock segment, Lines of Research, with Maria Hupfield, led by Maria Hupfield, with Esther Neff and Vikki Law. Maria?
And we were just listening to the music of Sister Mantos, Wampum's remix of the song Peyote, and Shark Siren, Name of Nothing. All right, welcome Vikki and Esther.
Thanks for having us.
And audience over there, Darla, nice, glad you're joining the crowd here. All right, so we're going to talk about lines of research, and I think there's, Vikki, you're a writer, a freelance writer, editor. You've written a lot about incarceration, about women, very published. So we have, both of you are coming at joining me with different ways of doing your research. And Esther, as a performance artist, owner of Panoply Performance Lab in Brooklyn, wearer of many, many hats, founder of many collectives. So we have quite a range of things we can talk about today. But maybe we can start by telling me a little bit about projects you're working on right now.
Aha. Well, I think the first thing is I flinched a little bit when you... I'm Esther Neff, sorry. I flinched, Maria, when you said the owner of Panoply Performance Laboratory, because I think it's quite the opposite of that in a lot of ways. My work is mostly focused on researching forms of life. So Panoply Performance Laboratory is engaged in a series of ongoing performances researching how artists can live and work ethically, both in community and as individuals. Right now, we just released a project called 9 Propositions, which will be 9 think tanks, which people sign up to participate in, and they can collaborate, or it's a mutually supportive think tank group. And each of those think tanks are organized around a mode of cultural manifestation or materialization. So we're trying to move away from production models and to talk about how we can create art in a post-capitalist and other ethical manners. Yes, that's what I'm working on right now. Lots of other things.
And I've known you a long time, I think pretty much since I first moved here over 8 years ago. And you're one of the first artists who I met, performance artists who I met. And you turned to me after I had just moved all the way from the West Coast to be an artist here in New York. And you said, "Isn't it great, Maria, that we can finally accept that they're just going to ignore us, we're not going to make any money, and we can finally do what we really, really love?" All right, Vikki. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
So I write about women. I write about women in prison. I focus mostly on the intersections of incarceration, gender, and resistance. I sometimes write about men and people of other genders in prisons, but that is my main focus. I write a lot of articles looking at the intersections of incarceration and gender, and I am currently working on a book which is tentatively titled Your Home is Your Prison, about the ways in which the popular alternatives to incarceration, like electronic monitoring, long periods of probation, and other supposed alternatives to locking people in jails and prisons, actually expand the carceral system into our homes and communities.
Very, very toxic. Maybe can you share a little bit with us about how you got involved with this work, because it takes another sort of vein from the idea for the line from school to prisons, right?
Yes. So actually, speaking of schools and prisons, so I went to a high school which now we would call a school to prison pipeline school, which is the kind of school where people who are mostly low income, people who are people of color, immigrants, people whose families don't have any kind of social capital get sent to regularly. And these are the kinds of schools that are overcrowded. There are metal detectors, there are security guards, there are more security guards than counselors a lot of the time, and if you didn't stand out in some way in the school, like there wasn't any sort of like support for the students. So they were also perfect recruiting grounds for gangs at the time. So a lot of my friends, when faced with the choice of joining a gang, making a couple of $100s every night, or going to school and sitting in this classroom where nobody cared if they were there, and not really seeing a future ahead of them, decided to join gangs. They ended up dropping out because why go to school if you're up all night, making money, and eventually got arrested for gang-related activity, and their families not having the money to afford bail, they were sent to Rikers Island, which is an entire island devoted to mostly pretrial detention. There's like 9,000 something people on Rikers Island on any given day, and 85% of them are there because they can't afford bail and they're waiting for their day in court. So my friends got sent to Rikers Island, and I went to go visit them every week, and that was my first introduction to incarceration. Mm-hmm. So I would take this, I'd take the subway, I'd get off in Queensboro Plaza at the time, which is where the Rikers bus stopped. And then you get on this special bus, and you have to pay your fare for this special bus, even though that's the only way to get onto the island. And you take this bus across this long, long bridge, you land at Rikers Island, and then there's a lot of waiting for your 1 hour visit. So you get to the processing area and you wait, and then they put you on a little school bus and you go to whatever the housing unit is that your friend is in or your loved one is in. And, and then you wait to get processed. And when you go to visit a jail or a prison, you're not allowed to have all your stuff with you. So you have to put it in a little locker, and then you just wait, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And if you got there promptly at 7 in the morning, maybe you'd wait an hour and a half or 2 hours or 2.5 hours for your visit. If, God forbid, you got there at 9 o'clock in the morning or 10 o'clock in the morning, you were just there all day. And so with nothing to do, you just make friends with all the people around you because you see the same faces every week. It's mostly black and brown women, visiting their their sons, their husbands, their boyfriends, their brother. And we would get to talking, and they'd always be like, who are you here to see? What's he in for? And again, the stories were that they were there for either substance abuse issues or for, some sorts of crimes that were I didn't have any other opportunity. I was trying to get a job and I couldn't, so I just went back to doing the thing that I knew how to do to get money. And that was the story again and again and again. There was no Bernie Madoff that ripped off, billions of people, out of their retirement funds. There was no, there were no Jeffrey Dahmers or serial killers, Zodiac killers. Everybody was there because they didn't have resources and access to opportunities for something else. And so that's kind of what started me on this idea of, looking into incarceration. So fast forward a few years, I go to college, and I start doing research on prison uprisings and rebellions and organizing after the 1970s. So what happens after COINTELPRO has decimated all the liberation movements? What happens after there's no more inside-outside connections and political organizing that's happening? What does political organizing inside prison look like in the age of Reagan and the start of mass incarceration? And at the end of the semester, I looked at what I had, and everything I had was about men. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking, at the time there were maybe 99,000 women in prison, and I was thinking what are the women doing? They have the same horrific conditions that they're facing, and all 99,000 something women aren't just sitting on their hands, so they must be doing something. And so I started asking around to different people who've been studying prison organizing and prison conditions, people who had been involved in prison activism work for years and years and years. And again, they were women just aren't networking, they're not organizing. And I felt like that was just not true. So I repeated this to the professor that I was studying under, Jean Theo Harris, who's at Brooklyn College. And she said to me, well, this is what you're going to do next semester. You're going to, do a research project that looks at women's organizing in prisons. And at the time, I was 8 months pregnant. I did not want to hear that I had to do anything else, other than do my required courses and get my degree and get out of college with a newborn. And I was like, I'm about to have this baby. I think you know this. I don't think that I can take on another course. I really just want to do my required, science course and my required whatever other course and get out. And she said, no, I think you can do this. You've shown the aptitude for scholarship. You've shown that you're asking the right questions. This is a topic that you yourself have identified as nobody writing about or nobody talking about. So she said, I want you to do this. And I understand you're about to have a baby. So here's what we'll do. You don't have to come all the way out to Brooklyn College every week, to come see me the way that people would normally have to do. You know, we can meet whenever is convenient for you, wherever is convenient for you. So we'll find another place to meet. You can bring the baby, you know, like if you need to, I will hold the baby. The only thing that you cannot do is slack on the scholarship.
Right.
And so that's what started me looking at what was going on inside women's prisons. And it wasn't anything that was really being kind of put together as some sort of like, here is a work that looks at what women are doing to resist and organize in prisons. It would be like, here is some, you know, like here's this bad thing that happened to Marcia Smith. You know, poor Marcia Smith, bad things happened to her. You know, here is the bad thing that happened to Jane Doe. Bad things happened to her. And there wasn't really any scholarship that was looking at what women themselves were doing to organize and challenge these conditions.
Thank you. Yeah. So a lot of blaming the victim and sort of,
or not understanding that the women also had agency and were
Right.
doing things. So it was like, if something had happened that changed these conditions, it was because an outside entity came and did this.
Right.
And not this outside entity became aware of these issues because the women themselves were writing letters to everybody that they could think of. They were like, how do we change this condition? Until sometime in the 1980s, in New York State, social workers often didn't want to bring children of incarcerated parents to go see them in the prisons because, as I described with Rikers Island, it's a really onerous process. And so if you're a social worker, you don't necessarily want to go through this onerous process in order to bring the kid to visit their parent. And, you know, and you combine that with these ideas around bad parenting, particularly bad mothers. Bad mothers are mothers who end up in prison. So why should I make this extra effort to bring the kids to visit their bad mother who is in prison? And women actually got together and they organized and they actually got the Child Welfare Agency to pass a policy that said that social workers had to bring their children in foster care and in the child welfare system to visit their parents, and that incarceration was not a reason for them not to get the same visits that non-incarcerated parents would get. And this was because the women themselves organized. They were like, how do we do this? We're not getting visits. You know, are you getting a visit? I'm not getting a visit. Are you getting a visit? I'm not getting a visit. And then they started reaching out to people. They started reaching out to lawyers. They started reaching out to advocates. And I'm sure they got a lot of no responses, a lot of people who were like, I don't want to be bothered, or I don't have the capacity to do this, until they finally found people that could help them figure out how to change these policies.
right. So we're really seeing the way that the way that politics of violence are playing out within various communities. So there's a spilled glass of water on the table that we're just attending to here. It's all around us here. This is no coincidence that it is playing out. So, and a stripping of power
Yes.
for the women. And that's in Canada, where I'm originally from. The numbers escalate for Indigenous women who are in
Yes.
jail. So that really, really is a full-on, like, thank you, Jason, for getting that. Disempowerment
Yes.
and strategy that's used around gender, race, that even now I can feel all the more so, right? And also coming from a community where I can see how people, when you're from a community and you're implicated, that you would care, but often how do we get people on side? How do we advocate for supporters from outsiders, right?
Yes.
How do we get them on board?
Yes. And it's interesting that you talk about the ways in which incarceration has hit Indigenous women in Canada, and in states that have slightly larger Indigenous populations in the U.S., like Montana and Oklahoma, there's actually higher rates of incarceration for Indigenous people. So in Oklahoma, which has the highest rate of incarceration for women in the country, so if you are a woman, you perhaps don't want to live in Oklahoma, and they're the bottom 50 or the like bottom 10 for like things like mental health, you know, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Native women make up 9% of Oklahoma's state population in general, and they make up 13% of the
Right.
prison population. You know, and we can see the ways in which, you know, like there's racism, there's also cuts to social safety nets, so like things like, you know, trying to get mental health care, or, you know, like trying to get substance abuse treatment, or trying to just like make it, you know, in society, like get cut away. And the replacement for that is prison. In Montana as well, there's like a huge rate of incarceration for Native people.
Thank you for that, for sharing those stats.
One of the things that I'm interested in while you're talking to you and I, we've talked about a lot of these themes,
Yes.
especially, and I'm interested in some of the creative output that some of your, I guess, friends or relations make while they're there. Where I'm from in Texas, there's a large indigenous population that's incarcerated, and one of the battles they've been fighting over, and I don't know, since I moved to New York, I've become disconnected from that dialogue, is in terms of being able to realize cultural traditions. You know, having any
Yes.
type of social gathering is discouraged. What are the experiences or the stories that you've been told with women who, and their kinds of customs or maybe practices, or even sorority, in terms of being incarcerated? How has that changed over time? Is it the same? Is it better? Is it being allayed?
I think it depends on prison to prison. So if you think of every prison as each warden's individual fiefdom, but then wardens retire, they leave, they get they go someplace else, and then you start all over again. So recently at the federal prison in Dublin, California, there for many years has been a formalized group of indigenous women, and they were allowed to do I'm sorry, I forget what the name of it is. The ceremonial dance, powwow, I think. They were allowed to like have ceremonial regalia. You know, they made it themselves. And then there was a new, it wasn't the warden, maybe the assistant warden, but somebody higher up that came in recently and decided that they were not allowed to do that anymore. They weren't allowed to wear the ceremonial regalia. They weren't allowed to wear any of these things that had been in, like that they had been allowed to do for so long. They also weren't
that they had been allowed to do without problem.
Without problem. And there had been no problems, but she had decided that this violated the prison safety and security. And so she threw all these things in the garbage. And a woman actually wrote and said, I'm heartbroken because I see all of our work, being thrown in the garbage. And then she said, well, you can still do your ceremony, but you can't do it with these things. And she didn't care that, they had done this for years without problem. She didn't care that, this was part of a tradition. She didn't care that they had been doing this. The prison had allowed this, again, for years and years and years. This was just suddenly something that she decided didn't fit in with what she had seen in other prisons. So therefore, it was just forbidden. But for years before that, they had been allowed to do this without problem. They had been allowed, to do a sweat lodge without problem. They had been allowed to have their group and to be able to maintain their heritage and tradition even inside prison without problem. And then all of a sudden somebody new comes in and these things are suddenly a problem.
I'm curious, just with this recent events of the Guantanamo Bay art exhibition that faced shutdown here in New York out of John Jay, do you think that, my assumption is that this is both racialized and a product of the position that inmates and those affected by the criminal justice system have in American society? We're seeing not just particular jail contexts having art dismantled and the previously long recognized therapeutic effects of art and various other kinds of trade practices taken down, but also this attack on the idea that any kind can have a artistic expression or a place in society, from Guantanamo Bay to Oklahoma. What are your thoughts on the differences between these different jail contexts, and is there more of a general statement to be made about how prisoners are treated and how their cultural production is then totally dismissed? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, it depends on prison to prison, but in the 1990s, I was involved in starting a group called Books Through Bars, which sent free books to people in prison, and we then and now, like if you like put all of the like letters and stacks by state, like the letters from Texas would just tower over every other pile, and Texas has the second highest had at the time the second highest incarceration rate in the nation. And we would get these beautiful, beautiful envelopes because they would draw on the envelopes and make these envelopes into pieces of art. And then sometime in the 1990s or really early 2000s, the Texas Department of Corrections, so the entire state prison system, just said, no more envelope art. That's it. You know, like they weren't allowed to. So this thing that you could do where you couldn't really afford art supplies, you couldn't really afford, you know, like you were very limited in what you could get, but maybe you could get or you could borrow or you could barter for colored pencils. And if you were sending a letter out anyway, why not make this into a piece of art? And suddenly that all stopped because it suddenly became against prison regulations. So even something like that was just squashed. So I think that there are ways that people get around, you know, these regulations, and they try to create and they try to express themselves, but then oftentimes you're up against something that is arbitrary and capricious and isn't necessarily grounded in any sort of rationale. Like, what is the reasoning behind throwing out all the ceremonial regalia when there has never been a problem? What is the point of saying no more envelope art when it's actually never posed a problem?
I don't want to digress too much, but there's kind of, it's hard to develop trust when we can't rely or depend on something when it seems to be arbitrarily just reversed periodically. And I see that happening in our national politics in terms of the United States building international allies, because every few years suddenly everything just gets dismantled and everyone has to, pardon the phrase, start from zero all over again with the United States. But that's a whole different conversation. But I do see the meta here happening as well, and how harmful that is.
Yes.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of times people who are outside of dealing with prison abolition or these issues just see this kind of oligarchical corporate state, you know, that the prison industrial complex is completely unfathomable and just, you know, controlling and regulating people's lives down to the very moment. And I think that's true for lots of different groups of people. I mean, even just like the wage labor system that we have now is very coercive and extractive in that way. But I think it's really interesting what you were saying about perceiving incarcerated women, for example, as agents. That I feel like that's extremely important when we're trying to position or construct new ways for people to survive, or to research and inquire into ways that organization or activation can occur.
Yes, and that was one of the motives for me to start writing about incarceration, resistance, and gender, was looking at the fact that other people weren't doing it. There were some academics that were doing it, but almost nobody has access to or is able to afford these academic books. So if you're not, you know, ingrained in academia and have access to their academic libraries, you're not going to pay $40 for a book, you know, like to be able to like dig out, certain instances. Kind of history, or that kind of herstory, is lost, to so many other people. And when I first started writing to women in prison as part of my research, I said, what do you know about the organizing and resistance that's happening? And again, the women themselves just didn't know. They were like, well, men have Attica, they have, they have the Panthers, they have all these, they have a history of organizing that we don't have. And they didn't know that there had been women organizing to do things, maybe not in the same sexy way of taking over portions of the prison and holding hostages. Although I will say that in the 1970s, women in California actually had a Christmas riot because somebody decided at the higher up level that they were going to cancel the Christmas visit that year. And so women weren't going to be able to see their families at Christmas. And I don't know why, but the prison had a whole bunch of Christmas trees on the unit. So the women dragged the Christmas trees out to the yard, set them on fire, broke the windows, and refused to come back in until the guards were the riot squad was sent in. And then they were all locked down in their cells for Christmas. And somehow I met a woman that had been involved in that riot. And somehow they managed to circulate a document in which they listed their demands. It was like their 10-point platform, where they were like, we want access to our children. They also said, which in the 1970s was pretty much unheard of at the time, they said, we don't think that anybody should ever be sentenced to more than 5 years in prison, regardless of what they did, because it is impossible to reacclimate to society after being locked in a cage for 5 years. But this was something that they did. back in like 1970 whatever, and this was something that most people don't know about today. I mean, when I met this woman, she was like, oh, you wrote about that riot I was in. I was in that riot. I was like, oh, really? And she said, yeah, nobody ever writes about that riot. Nobody remembers us. So it's one of those things where it gets lost to her story because she wasn't reading some academic text that I found that little nugget in. You know, she was reading whatever, you know, non-academic people read.
Right. Thank you, Vikki. Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the other work you've done. Both of you work with different communities, and Vikki, a good example. Maybe you can both talk a little bit about the ways that you can work with communities in a non-exploitative way. So Vikki, I think the work you did with the zines, for example. So often people with very good intentions, well-meaning intentions, come into these situations, and then how do you, the power dynamics are just such that, and yet art is often a way that we can reach the heart before the mind, right? So I think it's a useful tool, and so we see artists who are trying to work with different communities, but end up being a little bit compromised, right? So whether it's capitalistic or in the different forms. So.
Yes. Well, I think one of the challenges is for people who've never worked with an incarcerated population, whether it's through art or something else, is that they don't necessarily know that there are all these barriers to collaborating and even communicating. Sure. Somebody actually told me this very funny story the other day in which a person that he works with is currently in one of the New York City jails, and somebody sent him, because they didn't know better, a food basket for Thanksgiving, like, you know, like one of those gift baskets. You cannot get a gift basket full of food in any jail or prison. Like, you know, like, so, and he found this out because the guards, whether to be really mean or to let him know that somebody was thinking of him, showed him the basket and said, somebody sent this to you, you can't have it. Right. I don't know if they like sent it back or if they ate it themselves. This part I'm unclear about. But like, you know, like this is a challenge that, like, you know, like if you have never dealt with incarcerated people, you just don't know that, like, you can't send these kinds of things in. Right. You can't call them. You know, like collaboration becomes really hard. Communication becomes very hard. That they're at this, you know, like weird, you know, like they're in a system where there are these weird mercurial rules where it's sort of like Officer A says, okay, fine, you can do this. Officer B says, no, you can't have that. Officer C, you know, was like, you can have this, but only on such a day under these circumstances, which makes collaboration really hard. And I think also there's the tendency to think that because they're behind bars, somehow, like, you know, like they don't need to have the same kind of agency that you would if you were collaborating with somebody else, where, you know, like you should actually tell them what's going on, and you should also be clear about your boundaries. So if somebody says, yeah, I want to collaborate, but also can you send me $100? You know, you might be like, I don't have $100, and you should not promise them $100, right, or that their painting will sell for $100, right, and that's how they would get it, you know. But to be very clear, like, this is what I can offer, you know, this is what I cannot, this is what I think might happen, but you might do this with me and you might still not get $100, or, you know, whatever it is. So I think that there is the, you know, like the being really clear and communicative, but also listening and being like, oh, wait, you're actually saying that I cannot send you that gift basket. Yeah. I cannot send you colored pencils, but you can buy overpriced colored pencils from the prison store, so I can send you $7 and you can buy colored pencils.
So we're really looking at ongoing commitment and care, and not going in blind. Like, yes, these are things that maintain an ongoing. Were you going to say? That's fine.
I mean, I imagine too that it's sort of like if you're collaborating, you know, like for any other, you know, artistic endeavor, you don't just parachute in, right? Be like, do this.
That's exactly. I think it was a good lead for Esther to talk about her collaborative efforts with Panoply. You know, in terms of Maria and I, when we talk about our experiences, we often there are stories about going in blind and collaborating with people, and those kinds of things,
or being approached in that way, or not knowing
the system. Which is what Vikki, in a very serious way.
Sure, understanding your role in that partnership. Is it a true collaboration? I mean, Jason, you have a great line, which is always like, is collaboration code for working for free? Or
what it is when people say collaborate with me, do they really mean work for me for free?
Yeah, yeah. But as performance artists, we are often working for free and being asked to work for free. I'm also aware of how, listening to you speak, Vikki, how we're constantly under threat as people living here. Our freedoms are constantly under threat, and so that it's not a joke to hear someone say "lock her up." I mean, that's a very real gendered power dynamic that's at play, very controlling.
Yes, and there are more and more things that people are getting locked up for. I mean, if you see it was shortly after the uprisings in Ferguson, there was a report that came out that said that people were being jailed for being unable to pay fees. People are being jailed for being unable to pay child support, but that actually doesn't provide support to the financial support to the child. I mean, I have very strong feelings about people who just refuse to financially support their child, but jail is not the answer to not providing financial support for your child. Locking somebody up and depriving them of their job, making them lose their housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, does not mean that they're going to then be like, oh, I magically have $1,000 that I can now give to my child. It's like, no, now I have even less than before.
Right. So you're listening to Lines of Research. That was Vikki Law, a freelance writer and editor, writer of the book Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women. She's also currently working on a book called Your Home is Your Prison. I'm Maria Hupfield from Native Art Department International. You're listening to Maintaining Good Relations with us. And sitting beside me is another of my good relations here, Esther Neff. Esther, can you tell me a little bit about, I guess, when you talk about, I often prefer the term action artist, the European term. So you're coming at this from a performance artist background. Can you talk about maybe some of those intersections and how you navigate the real world, and then also embodying that through action and performance?
Yeah, well, I think that art is often it's kind of a stealth mechanism a lot of times. I think there's always this sort of push to remetabolize artistic practices like performance or action art or even activism as art in order to kind of relegate it to this, oh, well, it's just art, kind of don't worry about it. And at the same time, artists, certainly like social arts practitioners, are invited to create structures. For free usually, because there's no product that's being sold. So I think right now, I guess we could talk about a cultural sphere is really interesting just in terms of how a lot of artists are really focusing on forms of social gathering, relationships, that it's really hopefully moving away from a commodity-based, sort of free market kind of input sphere. At least a lot of the artists that I know and work with and love and respect a lot, such as Maria and Jason here, are people who work intersocially a lot of the time. Even in performance art, that the works are often participatory, which brings us back to these questions of how do you work respectfully within a group? How do you negotiate the context of your own body and your own experiences and your perspectives and so on with those of others? And how do you prevent yourself from being that sort of parachute in? Or I think there's a sort of big conflict between self-determination in the arts that we perceive of as being this positive agency versus sort of manifest destiny, or certainly for white artists, like an overseer kind of mentality. So those are some of the questions that myself and a lot of members of my community are dealing with.
Because you're often working collaboratively as well, often in multiple different...
Yeah, I'm kind of a slippery person. I don't know. I like to, whenever these kinds of talks happen, I'm not really quite sure what to say about myself other than that I'm listening and trying to apply my labor and attention and conceptualizing energy where it seems appropriate. Or
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Panoply Performance Lab. I know you have a performance tonight.
Yeah, there's a show tonight, come by. It's a little lab space, so the works are usually research-based, deal with social gathering. I do want to talk about something that's happening in St. Louis. my mother and I work a lot with my mom, who's a food activist, and we just got an abandoned building in St. Louis, which is it's in a state of dereliction, but we're just starting just now to renovate it, and it will be a liberation lab. So I'm kind of going back to the Midwest where I'm from and trying to mobilize there. There's a lot of really interesting things happening in St. Louis. The Osage Nation just bought the last remaining mound that's in the city of St. Louis, which is only like 3 blocks from this building. And it's an extremely segregated city. The public school systems are really very messed up. So I'm really excited to be bridging Brooklyn and work here with St. Louis. Returning to the Midwest a little bit.
Right on. Can you tell me about the term lab? How you're so often, I think, when we're thinking of lines of research, that it's seen as, especially in the arts, that it's not the validity. It's often a fight, and in terms of looking at how your practice, how showing, how the work of it, how is equal to a scientist in a lab. So maybe you can connect a little bit with that.
Evaluation schemas and qualification schemas. Yeah, I think the term lab kind of connotes a lack of product, or it doesn't create like kind of consumption, like production consumption model between people who are there. And it's not about an artist producing a work and then that being consumed by an audience or a visitor to a space, but rather a team of researchers who are kind of practicing their becoming, or they're seeing kind of what their cultural situation is in that moment, very presence-based in terms, it's a very small space, so it does feel kind of like whenever there's a cluster of bodies in there, those people are going to get to know each other, at least they're going to smell each other.
One of the senses, I've been to PPL, and one of the things I often experience there is even though you're hosting individual performances, you have a lineup, I still feel very implicated that it is a collaboration between the audience and the performer there, and that it is a group involvement as opposed to just singular performers going on one after the other, and that's a really nice approach to that kind of thing.
Cool. Yeah.
Or in the way that things get programmed, in the way that the work speaks to each other curatorially, or...
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about your own collaborative efforts. Speaking of jumping from what my experience is there with, it seems like everything is already collaborative. You do a lot of collaborative work, and you sometimes do things with new groups, new people. You're one of the artists whom I look at who seems to be doing something different with different people all the time. What are your experiences with this, and what draws you to do this kind of work as opposed to working maybe with the same person over and over, or or that kind of thing, or wanting to be more expansive in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably relates to my biography, like with any individual. I grew up on an organic farm and permaculture site that was really relational. There were different people coming through all the time, like the rainbow people came and camped there, and that sort of thing. In EnviroCorps, lots of fluctuating people. And then I've lived communally pretty much my entire adult life. I lived at Eugene V. Debs Socialist Cooperative for in college, and then I was part of a 50-person arts and activism collective, and that got shut down by the police in Brooklyn. And now I live in a very, very public, I live at Panoply, in a very public space where people just come over and knock on the door, and you're like, hey, I guess we're collaborating now. So I think it's the form of my life that any self-determination that I have is about meeting as many different people as possible, and I think that's a privilege and a luxury to be able to relate to a lot of different people. And I think that's something that's really one of the best things about framing yourself as an artist, is that you really do get to move through spheres and contexts very easily. I work in the public schools for my day job, so I get to go into that kind of institutional hell, dare I say, and then come back and work with professional artists and that sort of thing. So
I guess one of the questions about, you had mentioned moving through spheres. Do you often find, or what's your experience? Like, I have very strong feelings about moving through these spheres that often, as a native artist, Maria and I talk about this a lot. We have a lot of conversations over and over again sometimes about just being there, being instrumentalized to affirm a certain kind of fetishization or someone else's ideas of a particular kind of artist, or an artist, maybe a woman artist. So I'm wary of those kinds of travels sometimes, but what are your experiences with that?
Yeah.
How do you cope or handle? Is there a coping mechanism, or does there need to be? Is there not?
Yeah, I was thinking about this while you were talking too. That there's we like to use, and by we I mean artists, I guess, like to use the word organizing. But there's a very, very fine line between that and engineering. That's of the kind that structures people's lives, often in an extractive and coercive way, or identifies something valuable that's from somebody's culture or from their background or experience, and then extracts that thing and basically like objectifies it and then markets it. So I think parsing what kinds of performative and relational processes are performed with regards to relating to different people, I think it's very much against very dominant valuation schemas. So it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of talking and listening, and a lot of things that are not seen as particularly valuable and are not seen as part of the quote artwork unquote itself. So we spend a lot, I think, eating together. I don't know, for me it's really practical and constant taming the snake of whiteness on my shoulder, and all of these other practices, very concrete daily practices.
Yeah, so we would have seen a lot of, I think right now in Brooklyn there's a lot of performance I've seen a lot of performance happening right now, right? And I'm wondering, in a way it's also possible in that way to see, to be performing all the time, which I think you're very much doing, or we see a lot of people who are, in a way that I think New York affords a sort of community aspect than other smaller communities. You have to reach much further, or you might know of someone's work, but you don't get to see it. But here we often get to see each other perform. We get more familiar over time. And I think that's a nice kind of dynamic that happens in the city.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything's at our fingertips. And there are a lot of programs for, I think this is a longer conversation. I would love to talk to you about, I know a lot of artists who work in prisons, and there are a lot of programs. There's a program at Rikers that my friend Jacob Cohen is a part of, and those experiences are not particularly porous to the rest of artistic practice, or they tend to be seen as a sort of like specialized labor rather than like members of an undercommons, or like people whose lives are not dominant or normative coming together to collaborate or to organize together. As a writer, I imagine that there's is there that moment when you're talking to the other family members that are like waiting in the waiting room, what are you doing here? Well, I'm writing about it, or...
Well, at the time, I wasn't writing about anything, so I was just sitting there waiting to go see my friends.
Yeah.
And they were sitting there waiting to go see their husband, their boyfriend, whoever. So we're just all sitting there, like all together, and that's, it's just this, the common experience of waiting hours and hours and hours for your 1 hour visit. Now you can wait hours and hours and hours, and your visit might only be 45 minutes. So it's there's a commonality there that so at the time I was 15, 16, 17. I think by the time I turned 18, all my friends went upstate, so I wasn't going to Rikers anymore. So there was that commonality. I wasn't like, hey, I'm a journalist. Although I have heard of journalists going in and getting booted out by, not by the family members, but by the Department of Correction officials who, even though they've identified themselves as journalists, have been told, and had gone in there before, weren't breaking any department rules, were not only booted out, but detained and held and intimidated because you are on Rikers Island, and this threat of not being able to leave Rikers Island is always present, like for visitors, for family members. I remember every single time going into the housing unit, you go through these double doors, and there's a guy there. We used to call him Woman House because he would always tell us all, everybody who got off the bus, if you have any drugs or contraband, you're gonna go to the Woman House. You're gonna go to the Woman House. It was constantly a threat. If we catch you with something that you are not supposed to have, we are going to lock you up. It didn't deter people from trying to sneak stuff in. I remember seeing a woman sticking a bag of pot in her bra strap, and I was like, they're gonna make you shake that out, right? And she had never obviously gone to visit, so she didn't realize that they make you do this. They make you shake off your bra straps and pull out your waistband so like it would have fallen down. And I was like, hey, you should not put that there. Like, but that, like, it was a constant threat. Like, you are going to go to the woman house if, you know, we catch you with something. So that happens also, like, if you are, like, going in for any reason, you know, like, if you step out of line, you're in an entire island that is a jail. You are forced to leave your cell phone in a locker. You can't call for help. You can't, you know, there is nobody there that can help you or that will help you.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you both for coming together. These two very different lines of research with Vikki Law and Esther Neff, looking at performance and incarceration. Do we have anything else you want to add?
I have a question.
All right, step over to the mic, young man.
So one of the things, and I've known both of you for a while, both of you have practices or professions that create objects, even though a lot of effort has been, we've talked a lot mostly today about the creative endeavor and the partnership with other people. But you guys make things. You come up with pieces of paper and letters. I've curated some of these items before. And Esther, we have a piece of work. What are your thoughts on the deliverables at the end of all of these partnerships? What value do you place on them? Or do you not place a value at all? Or what is the end result of these?
Do you mean a monetary value or
What do you tell me?
I mean, so as both you and Maria alluded to, I do a zine, which for people who don't know is like a small photocopied publication of art and writings by women in prison. And so basically women send me their writings or their art, you know, and it comes in like, you know, like a snail mail folded up piece of paper. And half the time it's like scrawled on a like piece of lined paper. Sometimes it's typed. Sometimes it's like written on like whatever. And then I retype them and I like put them into a zine format. And then I make, you know, a couple of 100 copies, and then I mail them back into women in prison for free. You know, if you're a man in prison, I ask for some monies. Otherwise, there are, you know, so many men in prison that I would quickly, you know, just go broke trying to send free copies out. But for a lot of the women, it is the only time that they get to see their words in print, and it's a form of validation. You know, it's not only a form of self-expression, but it's like somebody cared enough to put this in print. And it got sent to me, sent to like other people on my housing unit, or it got sent to me and then somebody on my housing unit stole it because they were so excited that there is something that publishes the words of women in prison. So I don't know if you can put a monetary value on that because it, you know, but at the same time I feel like the ways in which, you know, like I think it encourages people and validates people who have often been told your stories don't matter, your experiences don't matter, your words don't matter, we think you're lying, we think that you're, you know, we think that you're garbage, you know, like you're in prison, so you must be bad, you know, like it is something that counters that narrative. And then also, like, you know, because Esther is a performance artist, like two collaborations that come to mind when working with incarcerated people that took a long time, it wasn't like a parachute in, are two performances that one I've seen, one I haven't. There's a show that about a woman in solitary confinement. There was a collaboration between a woman who was in solitary confinement and her pen pal. That's a one-woman performance piece called Mariposa and the Saint, you know, about her experiences in solitary confinement. And they went back and forth through letters. You know, the woman on the outside would like kind of like put it into like one woman play format, snail mail the whole thing back. So this woman sitting in this 8x11 cell by herself. I think that the prison she was in had a window, but like it doesn't open. So you're sitting in there 23 and a half hours a day. So imagine being locked in a tiny bathroom, you know, and then she would get this letter with this, you know, like this thing, like, hey, what do you think about this? And then she'd be like, no. The guard would never say that, you know, like it has to be changed to that. And it was a way, I think, at first to make sure this woman just didn't go crazy and kill herself in such an awful environment, you know, like, and it turned into a collaboration, but it took months, if not years, you know, before it became a one-woman play. And then there's a woman who's incarcerated in Indiana. She and a woman who's also incarcerated in Indiana wrote a play, and they sent it to some theater company or some theater people in Arizona who are now putting this on, you know. So there are ways to do this so they can bring their words and their art to the outside, but it wasn't like we're going to mine this, and exploit this and take your
Right.
little thing and, like take it out. But really being like, okay, what do we want to do? And it might be from supporting somebody to be like, I'm really worried because you're going to spend 3 years in this tiny little box. Let's think of something to kind of get your mind out of that tiny little box, that
Right.
turns into a play. Or, hey, we're doing this and we want somebody to be able to show other people because we can't do anything with this otherwise.
Yeah, I think a lot of those elements hold true for artists. It's so that we don't go insane and kill ourselves, It's so that people whose voices aren't often seen and or heard are creating something lasting. It's about people going to a place to experience art, different forms of gallery and event. Yeah, all of those reasons. I don't think that art has to... I'm so disconnected from art as kind of luxury goods that I really can't speak to that at all.
Right.
Well, that's an answer in itself.
Yeah, I don't know, but I'd love it that something that I made with my hands is like in your house. I think that's very meaningful to me. But yeah.
All right.
Awesome. Well, I'm also aware of our roles as artists or as curators, or the need for not just having mentors, which I often hear a lot about, but also sponsors. So people who can sponsor space and create space for possibility for these other forms to emerge and to make space and to have those sorts of conversations around issues that might otherwise be buried.
Yeah.
Is it time?
All right. Well, thank you both for coming together and joining us here at Maintaining Good Relations.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
That segment was brought to you by our sponsor, Language Revitalization Programs. Remember that language is knowledge, and to lose a language is to lose a civilization. Your host for that segment was the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Why build a museum when you can buy a brand?
So, Chris, I have a question. Who sponsored that sponsorship?
That sponsorship of the sponsor of Louvre Abu Dhabi was actually sponsored by Disney's recent purchase of 21st Century Fox, because who doesn't love an entertainment monopoly?
I guess we'll find out.
I love it.
Loving you is the best thing that I could ever do. I know it through and I feel so blue, and I just keep thinking about you. Yeah, 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 yeah. And isn't this getting through to you? And isn't this song clue for you? Isn't it? And isn't this getting through to you? And isn't this song clue for you? Isn't it? Well, isn't it? Look at what I'm going through. Baby, I love you. Yeah, I'll be fine, but I ain't going out without a fight. Say yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Look at what I'm going through. Baby, I love you. Yeah, I'll be fine, but I ain't going out without a fight. Say yeah, 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 yeah. Loving you is the best thing so blue, and I just keep thinking about you. Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, 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 oh,
The government of Canada has approved the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project. The project will effectively triple our capacity to get Canadian energy resources to international markets.
Fuck Justin Trudeau! Fuck Justin Trudeau! Fuck Justin Trudeau!
Bitch, I go scored it. Bitch, I go scored it. Picture me rolling. Picture me rolling. Bitch, I go scored it. Bitch, I go scored it. Picture me rolling. Picture me rolling. Bitch, I go scored it. Bitch, I go scored it. Picture me rolling. Picture me rolling.
Yeah, yeah. Big chiefs in the building, homie, pipe down. Middle fingers up from my hometown. From underground chiefs to the braves to the briefs. Lucas got my back when it goes down. On the outside, I'm meta world peace. I'm the mouse in the palace inside. I'm a beast. Put a fist to the sky for the Sioux tribe. Middle fingers up to the pipelines. Shout out to the redskin bloodhounds. Holding down for the red camp right now. My people getting mauled, getting put on by the dogs, and we're still being cuffed like outlaws. Resurrecting the indigenous, back snake killers. We got every other village out there fighting like gorillas, and we're here to take the power from depleted legal maniacs. Our voice is a weapon and it's powerful, and I'm spitting ammunition. Rambo, coming out the shadow, no camo. No Tar Heels here, no Merland Steel. Don't fuck with me, I got hands, bro. For standing rock, I stand. They lose voice, I am. We deploy the braves, we destroy the land. About to take it all back with them village boys. Let's go.
Still we all gon' ride.
They don't enjoy us.
We on that ride or die.
Cause we warriors.
And that's word to the wise.
Fucking vultures, we stay loyal to the soil. Y'all can't beat us, might as well join us.
Bitch, we gon' score it.
Skoden, Skoden, Skoden.
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 Ever since I was a little KID, I've been feeling like my DAD. Every time he's around the RCMP, man, I'm ready to fight, cause it's we, not me. Man, I guess the apple didn't fall far from the tree when the goon swell abused their authority. Tell me, I'm a snow goon, man, I bring the D like Richard Sherman in the LOB boom. When I talk about the who's who, you ain't got a blues clue. We don't fit the same shoes, okay, old news. Atlanta's all we got and we refuse to lose, so we finna go Jordan 2-2, talk about boo-foo. By us, fuck you, we standing rockin' the lay low. Middle fingers to the sky like the buzzer had a guide. We gon' start a picket line and we'll be saints if we die. So true. Cypress Hill, homie, let's be real. Okay, here's the deal. My shit ain't never stank if you think that a tank ain't never gon' spill. Get the message that I send, dog. It ain't really that hard to comprehend, dog. I'm screaming fuck you till my skin turn blue like Sonic the Hedgehog. Still we all gon' ride.
They don't enjoy us.
We on that ride or die.
Cause we warriors.
And that's word to the wise.
Fucking vultures, we stay loyal to the soil. Y'all can't beat us, might as well join us.
Bitch, we gon' score it.
Skoden, Skoden, Skoden.
Bitch, we gon' score it.
Skoden, Skoden, Skoden.
Bitch, we gon' score it.
Skoden, Skoden, Skoden.
Bitch, we gon' score it.
Skoden,
Skoden! Skoden!
When we broke our coppers at the legislature building and the parliament building here in Canada, we broke a spell of false dominance and control. The true custodians of Mother Earth, we the tribal people have standing, and it is up to the people to uphold justice. That means that the law enforcement and the military first responsibility is to protect the tribal people of this land. And we want to remind you, American and Canadian citizens, that you are still our guests here, and we are still your hosts. Gayla Kessler. Gayla Kessler.
Bitch, I was scolded!
Street. First, that music you just heard, the first song was by Lacey Hill, Lovin' You, and the second song was Snotty Nose Rez Kids by Skoden, featuring Bo Dick.
And they were brought to you by the Feather Headdresses at Coachella and MoMA PS1.
Thank you.